Hi, I'm Professor McCoy, and today I want to talk about a topic called Reformed Epistemology. Now, I've spoken about epistemology before, and I've touched on some various theological ideas, but this is a specific topic in the idea of epistemology of religion. So what that means is this is a discussion of how we come to believe theological or religious propositions, and what the justification is for believing those theological or religious propositions. So this is a particular view on the subject called Reformed Epistemology, which was formulated throughout the latter half of the 20th century by such notable philosophers as Plantinga, Waltersdorff, and then sort of compiled by some other authors. I'm going to link below to a couple of brief summaries of the tradition. As for primary sources, I suggest you look into them on your own. If you find linked on the various encyclopedia pages that I'll link to below, you should be able to find some of especially Plantinga's work, some of Waltersdorff's work. Bergman is one who's done some excellent summary work of it. So, okay, what is Reformed epistemology? So, epistemology, first of all, is the study of how we come to know things, and how we come to believe things, and how we justify what we believe in order to call it knowledge. So, in general, it is, as I've mentioned before, about what we can know and what we can believe with some kind of warrant or some kind of certainty, rather than the study of simply what is, which would be, broadly speaking, metaphysics. So in this case, being a topic within the epistemology of religion, this isn't so much a discussion of what religious beliefs and what religious views or what theological propositions are true, but rather what justifies us in believing them, what allows us to say, I know that God exists, or I know that this religion is correct, or what have you. All right. So it's called Reformed epistemology, not because it's some novel development or something like that, but merely by more or less historical accident. It was put together by various philosophers in the so-called Reformed theological tradition. So in other words, this is the theological tradition following from John Calvin, so the Reformed or Calvinist tradition. Plantinga most notably, so Alvin Plantinga. It has some elements that are common to that tradition, although it isn't in any way essential to the Reformed tradition. There are Reformed theologians who hold to more classical or evidentialist views of epistemology, and there are others outside of the Reformed tradition who hold to something like Reformed epistemology. So, what is it? This is in stark contrast to what is broadly speaking known as the evidentialist tradition, or the classical epistemological tradition. The evidentialist position I've laid out in another video discussing William Clifford and his view, which can be boiled down to as the statement that it is wrong always and for anyone to hold a belief without sufficient evidence or without arguments. The Reformed epistemologists will disagree with this and say that there are certain circumstances, they will argue those circumstances include religious belief, where argument or evidence are not required to have a justified true belief, or in other words, to call something knowledge. So essentially this is a response to an objection to religious belief, in particular, that's raised from this evidentialist tradition. This is referred to as the evidentialist objection. It has two premises, and then a further conclusion. The first premise, which is generally hasn't been considered very controversial, is the evidentialist premise, right? That one should not believe things without sufficient argument or sufficient evidence, right? You should have a reason for believing what you believe. The second premise is that there are no good arguments or there is no good evidence for the existence of God or for any given particular religious truth that you want to dispute, right? This is a broad-based objection. And so therefore, one should not believe that God exists, or one should not believe in this particular religious proposition. And this follows pretty simply. Ordinarily, most apologists and most theologians will dispute the second premise. They will say that, contra the evidentialist objection, no, there really are good arguments for the existence of God. There really are good arguments for the truth of this particular religion, or there is evidence that this is true or that is true, right? Plantinga et al. Do something somewhat different. They dispute the first premise. Right? They dispute that all beliefs need to have a solid argument or evidence to back them in order for them to be knowledge. They will say that there are certain beliefs that they call properly basic, which can be known but don't require evidence or argument. So these properly basic beliefs are things like experience, immediate experience, sense perception, memory, what they call rational intuition, so beliefs that become immediately apparent upon consideration. All of these things are things that we believe, and they think we believe rationally, without having solid arguments for it or without having evidence for it, and especially without having evidence to rule out alternative explanations. So what is a properly basic belief? What delineates a properly basic belief from any other kind of belief, something that you would need evidence for, that you would need to back up with arguments or with evidence, etc.? Well, there are two requirements. One, a properly basic belief must be non-inferential. In other words, it can't be inferred from other beliefs. It has to be basic, right? So this is why we say properly basic beliefs. They have to be sort of a belief that immediately comes to you, that immediately comes to your mind, that you're caused to believe by some method other than other beliefs leading to it. For example, so if I reach over here and I take my coffee cup and I have a sip, right, you will believe non-inferentially that while I was recording this, I was drinking coffee, right? You know that simply via observation. You're watching the video, you see in the video me drinking coffee out of the coffee cup. I take a sip, right? You can even see there's coffee in here. Right? Then make sure I'm not tricking you or anything, right? So this is immediate observation. This is sense input, right? You see it. This is a non-inferential belief. You're not inferring it from anyone. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that it's infallible, right? This could be mistaken. This could be some really dark tea, not coffee or something, right? Or and you could just be, mistaken in your perception, and I could be leading you into that error, of course. Alternatively, this could be a very well done visual effect, right? It's entirely possible, although it isn't the thing that immediately comes to mind, of course. What immediately comes to mind is, I was drinking coffee while I was filming this. You see it, and then you believe it in a non-inferential sort of way. Contrast this with an inferential belief. Right? So you might infer from the fact that I was drinking coffee while filming this. You might infer from that the further belief that I made coffee before filming this. Right? Seems perfectly reasonable. But the only reason you would know that, the only reason you would have any reason to think that was the case, is because you already believe that I was drinking coffee while filming. Right? That's the more basic belief, that the belief that I made coffee is inferred from. So the belief that I made coffee before this is non-inferential. It is inferential to believe. So the belief that I made coffee before filming, before I started, that's inferential, and it's inferred from the non-inferential belief that I was drinking coffee while filming. And that simply comes from you having seen it. It's a belief that arises sort of on its own simply because you saw it. All right. Now this too, even inferential beliefs can also be fallible, right? They're perhaps they're perhaps more often incorrect. For instance, my wife could have made me coffee. I could have bought coffee and poured it into my own cup or something, right? All sorts of things could have happened as well. But it's important to note that fallibility can be in either case, right? An inferential belief or a non-inferential belief can both be fallible. It just would require different counter-evidence. And that counter-evidence comes to the other part. So a properly basic belief has to be non-inferential, like your belief that I was drinking coffee while filming. And then it also needs to not have a defeater. A defeater is some additional belief or some additional piece of information that if you had this piece of information or you believed this additional piece of information, it would undermine your belief. So, if your belief that I'm drinking coffee while filming, so that's non-inferential, that's a start. Now, suppose instead of me talking about drinking coffee, I had told you that this was tea, right? You might have immediately non-inferentially believed that I was drinking coffee just based on observation, but then once I say I'm drinking tea, that presents a defeater, right? You have testimony from the person experiencing the thing, right? More immediate experience. That leads you to believe otherwise, that leads you to think, no, I'm not drinking coffee, I'm really drinking tea. Right? There are all sorts of other kinds of defeaters. Right? Anything that would, in fact, undermine a non-inferential belief or an inferential belief. Inferential beliefs can have defeaters as well, although that's not exactly our concern when talking about properly basic beliefs. So, maybe another example is, suppose you think that it's unhealthy to smoke cigarettes. Right? This is an inferential belief, right? So there's a reason you think this, but it still works to illustrate the idea of a defeater. Suppose that you believe that cigarettes are unhealthy. Okay, and further suppose that the reason you have for believing this is that when you were young, when you were growing up, your mother told you that smoking cigarettes is unhealthy, so you shouldn't do it. Okay, that's true. However, suppose further that at some point you came to understand that your mother was, no offense of course, but your mother is a pathological liar, right? She comes up with crazy stories in order to help you, her beloved child, to do better in the world, right? But she comes up with these crazy stories that have no connection to reality, right? Really, her reason for telling you that cigarettes were unhealthy was because she saw all the cool kids smoking cigarettes, like maybe when she was growing up, and she figured that those cool kids would be a bad influence on her little baby, so she didn't want you hanging out with those cool kids who all smoke cigarettes. So she told you, as far as she knew, incorrectly, she told you that cigarettes are unhealthy, so you shouldn't smoke cigarettes. Right? This has no connection to the truth. Right? This has no connection to the actual reality that cigarettes are unhealthy. Right? Your mother didn't know they were unhealthy. For all she knew, they could have been perfectly fine. Right? What she was concerned about was something else entirely. So this means that if you knew this, right, if you knew that this was really your mother's motivation for telling you that cigarettes were unhealthy, this would be a defeater to your belief that cigarettes are unhealthy. Right? So in this case, it's still true. And in this case, you may well have developed other reasons for believing that it's true. And in this case, you may go on to find more reasons for believing that it's true, right? You may look into medical studies, you may have personal testimony from smokers, you may have tried smoking yourself and had negative health consequences, right? Any number of reasons that you could come to know that smoking is unhealthy, okay? But this would be a defeater for your original reason for believing, right? My mother told me, and I don't have any reason to distrust her, right? And there we go. So now you need other reasons. All right. Excuse me. So for a properly basic belief, or for a basic belief, a non-inferential belief, say you see something, right? So I live in Florida, and we see this all the time. Say you think you see water sitting on the road, right? You look down the road and you see water. You immediately believe, in a non-inferential sort of way, that the road's wet, right? Okay. Now, if you live anywhere in the South where it gets really hot, you know where I'm going with this. What you were really seeing was heat haze. It's an optical illusion caused by the tarmac of the road that makes it look shimmery, like there's water over it. But really, it's dry. You're just seeing an optical illusion. Right? So as you drive closer, the apparent water disappears. Seeing it disappear doesn't mean that you now have a new belief that the water is not there anymore, right? It would be unreasonable to think, oh, the water disappeared as I came closer to it. No. You're relatively familiar with this phenomenon, or maybe you're not, and you're just relatively familiar with how water on roadways works. And instead what you do, instead of forming a new belief about what the current state of the road is, what you do is you reform your old belief. You say, oh, my previous belief based on immediate observation, the apparent water on the road, my prior observation must have been incorrect. Right? So, driving closer and seeing the mirage disappear, that is a defeater for your non-inferential belief that the road was wet. Right? So, initially you had this non-inferential belief, but you encountered a defeater. Say, further, you don't actually drive closer. Right? Say you're just looking at this road, you're not driving along it, you're just looking at the road out your window, and it looks wet, right? You see water. But you also know, for instance, you haven't heard any sprinklers. It hasn't rained today or any time in the last couple of days. In other words, there would be no reason for the ground to be wet. It would be very strange for the pavement to be wet at this time of day, especially if it's hot out. You also know that it's, say, 90-something degrees. Right? Given all of this other data, right, that would constitute a defeater for your non-inferential belief that the road outside is wet. Right? Because all of this other data is leading you to believe, right? It gives you better reasons for believing that that apparently wet road outside is really heat haze. It's really a mirage. Right? Okay. So if a defeater like that is present in any way, then your non-inferential belief is not properly basic. It may be a basic belief, but it isn't properly basic. Right? Now, something to note about a defeater, Plantinga especially emphasizes about properly basic belief that it isn't merely your knowledge of a defeater that undermines a belief, making it no longer properly basic, but it is the mere presence of a defeater. So the counterfactual nature of this is important. So when I say a defeater is additional data or information that, if you knew about it, would undermine your basic belief. Right? What this means is that a belief you have can have a defeater even if you're not aware of it. And that would make your belief no longer properly basic. Okay. This makes Reformed epistemology, at least on certain readings, on this reading in particular, what we call, what epistemologists call externalist. In other words, there are external criteria that are external to our own minds, external to the things that we can know by introspection, right? Know about ourselves. There are external requirements to call something knowledge. Because I can't know if there are, in fact, defeaters unless I know about them. Right? So if I don't know about them, there may or may not be. Right? But this isn't important if Reformed epistemology is a correct way of thinking about belief formation. Rather, this is a feature. Right? Because the presence or absence of a defeater is something we can know about abstractly. It's not something that's dependent upon an individual person. So we can say that if there really is a defeater for someone's belief, then no, it's not properly basic. And so no, there isn't really a justification for believing it. Right? This eliminates the problem of justifications for false beliefs. Right? on a lot of more classical epistemological frameworks, you can have the problem of having a belief, like, for instance, the example of believing that smoking is unhealthy. You can have beliefs that aren't justified, but you think they're justified. And it seems to fulfill all the criteria for knowledge. Okay. Reformed epistemology avoids this by putting some of these criteria on the outside, so to speak. They don't depend on our internal states of belief and knowledge. Now I'm going to come back and criticize this somewhat as well, because there are criticisms to the externalism, and there are reasons why this particular epistemological tradition relies on externalism. But we can come back to that once we have the idea fleshed out. So another example of properly basic beliefs. So not only sense perception and memory, but beliefs through rational intuition. Right? So for instance, mathematics. Basic mathematics. 2 plus 3 equals 5. Right? To know that 2 plus 3 equals 5, you don't need to infer it, right? You don't need to infer basic truths of arithmetic from observation or an abstract mathematical proof. Like, these are treated as axioms. These are things that we know, right? We know how addition works. We know 1 plus 1 equals 2, not because we go 1, 2, right? It doesn't happen. Right? To understand arithmetic, what happens is we understand that one thing and another thing makes two things. We immediately, rationally intuit that that is the case. The same goes for any snap decision type mental math or any snap decision type exercise of logic. You simply know that the result follows, right? Simply by seeing it and intuiting that it's correct. Now, again, remember, even non-inferential beliefs like this can be fallible. So you could have made a mistake in your perceptions and your thoughts about this and your intuition. Perfectly fine. That doesn't undermine the theory. That doesn't provide a counterexample. It just provides an example of your intuition being fallible, there being a possibility of you being mistaken. Right? Okay. Other example might be the belief in other minds. Right? This is a very common one in the discussion of Reformed epistemology and epistemology generally. There's this problem in epistemology referred to as the problem of other minds. You know by introspection that you exist and that you have certain mental attributes and that you are, in fact, a person. You have a mind, right? But observing other people simply from the outside, not knowing what their introspection, what their inner life is like, it's impossible to know with certainty, simply based upon observation, that that person is really a person, right? Really has a mind, really has inner experience, and isn't just some kind of automaton, some kind of a robot, some kind of a philosophical zombie. On that concept, again, I'll put a link in the description on what philosophical zombies are, and if you're interested in this topic, there's an expansive literature on it. But suffice it to say that this is generally a problem for a lot of epistemological traditions. However, for Reformed epistemology, it's simple. It's a simple answer. I intuit that the person I'm talking to, or in this case, the person watching this video, is a person, not a bot. Right? I know that a person that I'm having a conversation with is a person. Right? And I know that simply based on, well, nothing. I don't need any basis for believing that. I simply interact with the person as if they're a person. I treat them as if they are a person naturally, and I assume that I'm correct, probably rightly. I don't need to examine them and make sure that their mind is really there, because first of all, I couldn't. Second of all, even if I could, even if there were a test, even if we were to run a Turing test or something, like a functional Turing test, on every person we encounter, we don't do that, and we don't feel a need to do that. Right? There's no necessary requirement to make certain that the people you're interacting with are really people and not not robots or zombies, or to know, for instance, that the ordinary people you're interacting with are really, average everyday folks who bear you no malintent and aren't really Russian spies, right? Okay, possible. It's possible, remotely. But you have no reason for thinking that. Now, this brings up a point about defeaters. Because you might say, okay, well, if the person you're interacting with were really a sufficiently advanced and complicated robot with no internal experience or anything, made of all organic parts, indistinguishable from a real person, right? Then all the evidence would be exactly the same, right? And this is the case, right? They would act exactly the same way, they would appear exactly the same way to all external observation, and we wouldn't be able to tell the difference if it were a sufficiently good simulacra. Right? Okay, true. I can grant that. But an alternative explanation like this doesn't qualify as a defeater. And this is important when we're going to get to one of the potential objections to applying this method to religious epistemology, especially. But we're going to hold off on that for a moment. But just remember here that an alternative explanation isn't enough to qualify as a defeater. A defeater actually has to be something that undermines your belief, not just provides an alternative explanation. Right? Because we can provide an alternative explanation for lots of things without thoroughly undermining our beliefs. Right? Okay. So, what does this do for us? Why bring up this version of epistemology? It seems, at least, that if this is merely to bring up the a counter argument to the evidentialist objection to religious belief, that it seems a bit like special pleading. You're saying that, well, maybe we don't need evidence for believing something. It's okay to just believe it, right? That seems disingenuous. Well, this does a lot more work than just that. This is actually a fairly strong theory, and it explains lots of things. So going back to this belief in other minds. A traditional or evidentialist epistemologist would be forced to say that we don't know with any level of certainty that other people have actual minds, actually do exist, because the evidence could lead one way or the other. You cannot determine based solely on the evidence. Now, you can make an analogy, maybe, saying, I acted a certain way, and I have experiences, I have a mind, they act similarly, so they must. But if they didn't, they would act exactly the same. So what something like Reformed epistemology does is that it makes lots of our everyday, ordinary beliefs rational. Right? Things we ordinarily treat as rational, things that we depend on their being rational, even to form other beliefs, it makes sense of them. Right? So even perception, right? So even perception or observation. So an evidentialist may say, all right, yeah, I can observe, say, that I'm drinking coffee. You can observe that I'm drinking coffee while I'm filming this, right? But the evidentialist will say, well, wait, there are alternate explanations. The evidence that you're observing could lead to other conclusions. We don't know for certain that your perceptions are reliable. Your perceptions are actually giving us truth, right? We can't simply rely on perception. We need an argument, we need evidence, we need data that we can collect. Same goes for anything. The same goes for any bit of anything that we consider a non-inferential belief. Right? So, for instance, another example might be, say, you're looking at something next to your computer, right, while watching this, and it happens to be red. Right? How do you know that? Well, how do you know it's red? Well, you look at it. It's red. I don't need to say any more. But an evidentialist will demand more. They will say, well, how do you know that? How do you know that your visual faculties are operating properly? How do you know that the lighting is normal? How do you know that that's not some kind of optical illusion like the heat haze we were talking about? Because all of that's possible. All of that would make sense of the evidence just as well. Right. So, okay, fine. Maybe you can make sure the lighting's fine. You can turn more lights on. You can check and make sure the thing next to you is really red. Okay? Still, maybe it's your perception. Maybe it's your eyes. Maybe something is going wrong with your visual apparatus. Okay, fine. Maybe you can compare that, the thing next to you that you think is red, you can compare that to something you know is red. You can say, all right, these things look similar. Right? They look like they have the same color. So it must be red. Okay, well, maybe your visual apparatus is still making errors. Okay, fine, you can bring in a spectrometer and measure the light reflected off of the surface of the thing that you think is red, and it shows up in the red part of the spectrum, and okay, it must be red. Okay, fine. Now, maybe even that's fallible, but we don't even need to get that far. Let me ask, while you were listening to this, did you bring in something else red to compare it? Maybe. Maybe you did. That's possible. Did you bring in a spectrometer to check your results? I will almost guarantee that you didn't. And yet, you're still rational in believing that the thing next to your computer is really red, and that's not just some irrational, superstitious belief or something like that, right? So, Reformed epistemology does this for us. It allows us to have most of the beliefs that we actually have, right? And to hold them rationally and to say, yes, these beliefs are solid. They have some basis to them. And they're not just free-floating. They're rational. These non-inferential beliefs we have some justification. We have reasons to say we know them. We know that these are true. Okay. So, now, potential issue as well. We can get into some of the objections now, some of the potential problems with this view. There is the potential, there is the possibility of these alternate explanations actually presenting a problem. And so, what I mean, for example, so evidence. So, say you have the rational intuition that God must exist, say. Plantinga thinks that you can have such an immediate intuition, right? That God exists, that a superior higher being, that a maximal being, a creator of the world exists. Right? You can have this kind of intuition, and that it can be completely rational. And in fact, he'll argue that most people who believe in God do so on the basis of something like this. Most people don't go through rigorous philosophical proofs for things. Certainly true. But that intuition, or say another reason might be you observe a sunset, you observe some beauty in the world, and you interpret that in some way as there being a God, there being a beautiful, rational creator to all of this. Okay, but an objector might say that this is subject to some interpretation. Right? You need to, in other words, interpret that intuition, or you need to interpret that observation as leading to religious conclusions. So this makes these kinds of beliefs inferential in a sense. Right? I observe a sunset, I observe the beauty in the sunset. Even that can be considered an inference. Right? I observe some collection of light. I infer from that it's beautiful, and I infer from that there's a source of beauty behind the cosmos. Okay. Similarly, I have a rational intuition, right? That's the claim, that God exists. Well, this intuition has to be interpreted in a certain way. Not just that there is something behind creation or something like that. That has to be interpreted as God in a particular theistic framework, right? And not just there's rationality to the world or something like that, right? There are other ways that we could interpret it, and that the interpretation of our evidence or of our observation or of even our belief interpreting it in a religious way requires some justification. Okay. The Reformed epistemologists will respond to this by saying that that the belief in God is not something that we infer from these observations, but it is the observation itself, or it is the intuition itself. Right? So there's no space to get the wedge in of interpretation or of demand for evidence or something like that. So that when you, for instance, to use our example, when you look at a sunset, what you're seeing, what you're observing, isn't just colors, right? It's not just the refraction of light through the atmosphere or something like that. What you're observing really is beauty itself, right? Transcendence. You're observing transcendence. And that intuition is really meaningful, and that really is the same kind of intuition as understanding mathematics or realizing that there's another person that you're talking to. It's the same thing, the same kind of thing. You can especially see this because the same kind of argument could be made, the same sort of objection could be raised to the problem of other minds. Sure, I need to interpret the person I'm speaking to as a real person. I need to interpret you, the audience, the person viewing this video, as a real person. Okay, I do. That's part of the rational intuition, right? I have this intuition that you're a real person, that the hypothetical person I'm talking to is real. That simply is the intuition, right? It's not that it goes beyond sort of an intuition of interaction, say, but it goes to, that's a person. I immediately, non-inferentially believe that. Okay, so that's the answer. So it's an answer they would give. So there's contention there, but fairly resolvable. Right. So another one, another general objection would be the presence of those who believe otherwise, people who believe otherwise. So how this is construed is so that all right, I believe in God, but there are other people who don't, or believe in a different God, or believe in God differently. Clearly, right? Everyone knows this. Everyone knows that there are people who don't believe the same way that they do. It's hard to explain that on a model of Reformed epistemology where these beliefs are properly basic, right? Religious beliefs are properly basic. They are non-inferential. They're from immediate apperception or immediate intuition. How is it that there are other interpretations of those intuitions, or there are other intuitions, or something like that? Well, a response could be one, those are misinterpretations, or those people don't have the same intuitions, or those people don't have the same observations. Well, that's perfectly plausible, but it becomes more difficult once you see the plethora of sort of alternatives. Now, of course, the alternative explanations themselves aren't a defeater. And again, so just like the alternative explanation for me taking a sip from this, the alternative explanation that there's tea in the cup doesn't undermine your non-inferential belief that I was drinking coffee while recording this, right? So the existence of, say, the existence of another religious tradition doesn't immediately undermine your belief in your own, right? Okay, fair enough. But it does present the problem. It does present a potential defeater that they could be correct based on the same reasoning that you employ. There are other people who have these non-inferential beliefs, but those non-inferential beliefs are different from yours. Okay. The general response to this that most Reformed epistemologists will give is that this doesn't present quite the problem that you might think it would. Right? So it doesn't present the problem that the alternative explanations present a defeater. And again, so like I said, it's only presenting alternative explanations or alternative possibilities. The assumption would have to be that either there must be some unknown defeater for one or the other of ours. So there could be an unknown defeater for mine, there could be an unknown a defeater for theirs they don't know about. But concerns about their beliefs don't affect my immediate non-inferential beliefs. What matters to my belief is whether there's a defeater for it. And I'm not aware of any. So, therefore, my beliefs are still rational as far as I know. Now, this does present a problem of ignoring potential defeaters, which brings up parts of probably the most famous objection to Reformed epistemology, which is called the Great Pumpkin objection. So this comes from the Charlie Brown Halloween special from the 1960s, called It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, where Linus believes that the Great Pumpkin will arrive at the most worthy pumpkin patch every year on Halloween to give gifts to the children. Right? So it's sort of a Halloween Santa Claus idea. Right? And that Linus believes in this Great Pumpkin in a properly basic way. Right? It's non-inferential, and he doesn't have any defeaters for it. He doesn't know of any defeaters for it, at least. Okay, so it seems that, one, it seems that you can use something like Reformed epistemology, this method of Reformed epistemology, to come to some very absurd beliefs, like the belief in a magic giant pumpkin that visits pumpkin patches and gives gifts to children. Right? Similarly, an atheist may say, so an atheist objector may say, that this properly basic belief formation can lead to absurd beliefs like the existence of an immaterial person who created everything from nothing. Right? That may seem just as absurd. Now, at the same time, it can lead to perfectly ordinary beliefs, but even those perfectly ordinary beliefs could perfectly well be mistaken, as we've gone over. So how can we be sure that this belief formation process is in any way reliable if it can give rise to absurd beliefs like the Great Pumpkin? Well, the Reformed epistemologist will reply that for an idea to be properly basic, there must be no defeaters to it. This is the externalist element. And this is the idea that there must be nothing that, if they knew about it, would contradict their beliefs. Right? In the case of the Great Pumpkin. And so if you remember from the special, I am going to provide links to each part of it below in the description as well, so you can watch it again, just to refresh your memory. If you haven't, just leave this open and feel free to go watch it. It's wonderful and wholesome, and I love it. I love all of the Peanuts holiday specials. But in any case, right? So Linus. So now that you're back, or if you remember, fine. Linus goes and waits for the Great Pumpkin to arrive at his pumpkin patch, at the pumpkin patch of their town. So he waits all night. He's up all night waiting for the pumpkin patch. But remember, the Great Pumpkin only arrives at the worthiest pumpkin patch, the most sincere pumpkin patch. But he has a moment of doubt partway through the night. Maybe the Great Pumpkin doesn't exist, and that he interprets as enough to keep the Great Pumpkin from judging his pumpkin patch as the most worthy. Right? Okay. Now, the Great Pumpkin not showing up, not just that Halloween, but the Halloweens in the past as well, should constitute a defeater. So if I say, I expect the Great Pumpkin to show up this Halloween, and then it doesn't, that's a reason to reform my beliefs. If that's a defeater. Now, for Linus, he has an alternative explanation for the defeater. But we should ask whether that alternative explanation, whether that explanation away for the defeater is good enough. Whether dealing with the defeater, the apparent defeater, in that way is sufficient. And we can ask this question of religious belief as well. Right? So, say if you believe in God, if you believe in a loving God, and then you see a tragedy strike, you see something terrible happen, that can provide a problem for your belief. It can provide reasons for doubting that God exists. Now, how you deal with that objection, whether you think that is a real defeater or not, whether you take that as a real possibility, or whether you've managed to counter-argue, or if you've just dismissed it, how you deal with that objection will determine whether this belief is still justified or not. So this is where the Reformed epistemologist will answer. They will say that, look, if there are potential defeaters, that even if you are aware of them, that you refuse to deal with them, that's different from saying, here's a possibility. It might be this way. It might be that way. This is a proposed solution. So as long as you can come up with a proposed solution to these potential defeaters, then the rationality of the belief depends on a couple of things. One, how well you deal with the defeaters. And that brings us back to something like, apologetics. This brings us back to rational discourse in the traditional sense of dealing with problems, dealing with objections. And then in addition, the Reformed epistemologist can also say it really does come down to whether there really is a defeater or not. So they can appeal to external standards. They can appeal to what is objectively true. Well, if it is objectively true, then it could still be a properly basic belief. But if it isn't, and there really is a defeater, and this defeater is real, it exists, there is some fact that if you knew it would undermine your belief, then it isn't properly basic anymore. And this is why Reformed epistemology it falls, at least in some cases, under the category of presuppositional apologetics, because it presupposes that the beliefs that are supposedly known in a properly basic way are true. Right? Because if they weren't true, then they wouldn't be properly basic. Right? There would be a defeater. So, again, this isn't necessarily a problem. Right? This isn't necessarily a problem for formation of a belief. Right? Because again, we're not necessarily discussing in this, because it's in the field of epistemology. We're not discussing whether this is true or not. Right? We're not trying to determine with any kind of certainty, in this case, whether God exists or not, or whether this or that religious belief is true or not. What we're trying to determine is whether religious beliefs are rational, are grounded. And in this case, we would have to say that, okay, yes. Yeah, as long as they are believed in a non-inferential way, and if they are believed without the presence of a defeater, then in that case they were perfectly rational, just like belief in sense perception, belief in our memories, or belief in rational intuitions. Okay. So one final topic I want to touch on is some more potential objections, or at least suggested further reformations, if you will, to the idea of Reformed epistemology. This time from a Catholic perspective, as opposed to, or as an alternative to, the particularly Reformed or Calvinist perspective that gave rise to Reformed epistemology. Most prominent among such objectors is Linda Zagzebski, who wrote the book, who edited the book and contributed to the book, Rational Faith, which is a collection of these various objections. So hers, in particular, rely on pointing out the very particular Reformed Calvinist doctrines that give rise to something like Reformed epistemology. In her argument, these are the individualism of belief, or of belief formation. So individualist epistemology, that this relies on an individual's rational intuition. And then further, the starkness of the Calvinist version of the doctrine of original sin, or what will sometimes be referred to as total depravity. Right. So I'm going to go at the second one first. So the reason this is important, if you're not familiar with this distinction, the Catholic view of original sin is that we inherit the mark of Adam's primal sin. Right? This is an explanation for human imperfection. In summary, right? So we are imperfect, especially in our wills. We are tempted to sin, and we act against what we know to be right. Okay. The Calvinist or Reformed view is much stronger. Is the view that we are totally depraved, or we are totally sinful due to this fall. In other words, every faculty we have is irreparable, or is damaged beyond our capacity to repair, and we need grace the grace of God in order to do anything. Right? Okay. So the main distinction that Zagzebski points out here is that the Calvinist view has a much darker view of human reason than the Catholic view does. So the Catholic view of original sin focuses primarily on the sinfulness or the fallenness of the will. So we will to do the wrong thing, and so due to our fallen nature, due to our corrupted natures. The Calvinist view of total depravity, on the other hand, thinks that not only is our will corrupted, but so is our intellect. Our capacity for reason is gravely damaged by the fall. And so any rational exercise that we might carry out can also be similarly critically fallible. Right? And so what this leads to is the idea that our rational capacities are not necessarily reliable, except insofar as they are made reliable by the grace of God. And so this winds up being a counter-argument to the potential objection of, or a certain way of arguing against the potential objection of alternative religious beliefs or lack of religious belief in some people. Right? So if human beings are totally depraved and our ability to reason or our ability to, say, intuit is entirely damaged or entirely destroyed by the fall, by the stain of original sin, say, then only by God's grace can we even have rational intuitions at all. So these rational intuitions include, or can include, religious belief. So lack of religious belief is explained by a lack of grace, or is explained by our innate sinfulness. Okay. The Catholic view is different. And the Catholic view says that we are not entirely damaged by the fall. Okay? That we bear these stains of original sin, that we have these, we might refer to them as injuries or something like that. But that our belief formation process, our belief formation faculties, in other words, our intellects, are not as severely damaged. And that our intellect is only damaged insofar as it's guided by the will. So Zagzebski brings up the alternative view of what she calls cognitive voluntarism, which is a general trend in various streams of theology. That belief, any kind of a belief, is chosen rather than just sort of happening or being brought about. So the Reformed epistemology, the view of Reformed epistemology, is that these beliefs, these properly basic beliefs, are simply brought about, like beliefs are brought about by perception. Right? By contrast, Zagzebski's view is that our beliefs are chosen, right? So that our beliefs, when we have these intuitions, we can choose to believe them or not to. When we have perceptions, we can choose to believe them or not to. When we come to a conclusion, even from an argument, even in an inferential way, we can choose to believe it or not. We can choose whether or not to make a certain argument or to believe it. Right? And so this is what allows for the distinction of people coming to different conclusions, right? We can have different inputs, we can have different data, but then we can also choose to believe different things. And so people's beliefs diverge. So, The other aspect that is a significant difference between Reformed doctrine and Catholic doctrine that makes a difference for Reformed epistemology is that Reformed doctrine, in terms of the responsibility for belief, is incredibly individualist. Each believer has the responsibility of coming to form beliefs, whereas the Catholic doctrine is more communal, that the church as such comes to beliefs about religion and beliefs about God, and that the individual's responsibility is to believe, is to simply assent to those beliefs that have been proposed by the church as a community. What this means for Reformed epistemology is that, so the Reformed epistemologist says that each of these properly basic beliefs are individual, are on an individual level. I have a rational intuition that God exists. Therefore, I am justified in believing. You'll notice that there is a very common way of forming beliefs, of coming to believe things, that's left off the list of properly basic for the Reformed epistemologist. So remember, we have sense perception, we have memory, we have rational intuition. What we don't have is testimony. Okay? So belief that so things we believe based on what other people tell them. In fact, most of the beliefs we hold have some element of testimony to them, or at least a lot of them do. Okay? So you saw me drinking coffee. I raised doubts about that. I said, "Oh, this might be tea. It might be some very clever, digital alteration." Right? It's clearly not. Based on my past videos, it clearly isn't. But me saying that I'm drinking coffee while filming this is a significant factor towards you believing it. Right? So if I had taken this and sipped it, say, and given the angle of the camera you couldn't see what was in it, say, you wouldn't have much of a reason to think it was coffee. You might think it was tea, you might think it was water, you might think it was any manner of other things. Right? Any of these beliefs might come to your mind. Me saying, I'm drinking coffee while filming this, that can constitute a reason for believing it. Now, it's hard to say that that constitutes evidence for believing it. Hey, Angel. Come on up. Do you want to come up? I'm going to get you. She's going to sit here now. Right? So, anyway. Where was I? So, me saying that I was drinking coffee constitutes, we wouldn't say evidence for believing it, but we would say me saying it constitutes simply a reason for believing it. Similar to, I remember doing something, or I see that something is the case, right? You see there's a cat on my lap, right? In a similar way, if you were to say, check the weather report, you believe that, say, that it's not going to rain tomorrow, not based on saying, I observe that the weather report says that it won't rain tomorrow. I combine that observation, that belief from observation, with another belief that I have that my trusted source of news is in fact reliable. And it's reliable because the meteorologists who work there are credentialed, and right? We don't combine all of these beliefs in an inferential sort of way. What we really do is we look at some kind of testimony. Right? In this case, a weather report, and we say, it's probably not going to rain tomorrow. Right? We immediately believe it in a non-inferential sort of way. Same thing goes for any kind of a report for anyone. Say I tell you that I'm recording this on Friday. Right? I'm recording this on Friday. Do you believe me? Probably. You don't have any reason to doubt what I'm saying. And further, you just immediately believe it. Now, maybe you can check somehow. Maybe you can You can see when I uploaded it and then reason back from that to seeing what day it must have been I recorded it, knowing how long I usually take to edit things or something like that. Or maybe you can dig out the file from YouTube's archives and you can see when it was recorded based on the file type. Okay, maybe. But you don't do any of that. You just believe that I recorded it on Friday, presumably. This isn't based on any kind of evidence or any kind of data. It's based on testimony. It's based on me saying it. So this is how we believe a lot of the things that we believe. Right? We believe them based on someone else saying that it was the case and us simply trusting them. Right? This is a matter of belief formation that Zagzebski points out is just as important as the other means we have of reaching properly basic beliefs. And that this coming to believe things based on testimony and based on trust of other people is essentially communal. Right? It depends on a community of believers, and that the community of believers in any given truth, in this case religious truth, but this can apply to anything, the community of believers is essential in most cases to coming to certain beliefs. Right? This is the case very obviously for any kind of academic belief, right? So anything that you come to believe based on some kind of schooling is certainly going to be based on testimony. So say you're, especially say in the sciences, if you are running an experiment, what you're not going to do is you're not going to replicate the experiments of all of the scientists who have worked before you to double check them and prove them yourself in order to, say, prove the formulas that you're using. You're not going to do that. You're going to look up the formulas. Maybe you're going to have a textbook. Maybe you're going to have a textbook with it. Maybe you're going to find primary sources. Maybe you're going to even look at the reports of their experiments. But even still, you're not going to find out on your own. You're not going to figure it out yourself. You're going to use that data. So even your new discoveries that are your own depend upon the discoveries and the knowledge of other people in a particular community, in a belief community. Zagzebski emphasizes this element of testimony, this element of community of belief, as important contra the Reformed epistemologist. The Reformed epistemologist is primarily concerned with what each individual believer has to think, and what each individual believer has as justification or as warrant for their religious belief. Whereas Zagzebski, and what some call, on kind of a play on words, counter-Reformed epistemology, relies on the intellectual developments and the beliefs of other believers. So to note, this still does, now understanding testimony and a community of believers is important to formation of religious beliefs, still does the important work of making most people's beliefs rational. Right? And we tend to believe that most people's beliefs about most things are rational, at least most of the time. Right? So if you're an evidentialist, that you need to challenge that. So the problem arises of grandma at church, right? So grandma has been going to church all her life. Your grandma, my grandma, doesn't matter. Going to church all her life, had never even thought of an argument for or against religion, but just believed it because that's what the church has believed, right? This is what the church taught, so I believe it, right? So this kind of a person, which is the vast majority of people with respect to the vast majority of things that they believe, not just religion, but other topics as well, the evidentialist will have to say that those people are all irrational, which includes you. It includes me. There's lots of things that I believe that aren't based on my own observation, my own evidence, and my own arguments. They're based on what other people say. They're based on other methods of properly basic belief formation. But they aren't based on evidence or data or argument. Right? But the Reformed epistemologist thinks that a lot of these things are, okay, see you later, that all of these things are by default rational, right? The things that we believe based on these immediate non-inferential kinds of beliefs are in fact rational. Zagzebski says that not only are these properly basic kinds of beliefs that Plantinga, etc., will say, we'll talk about, not only are those rational, but so are beliefs based on testimony, which again are most of the things that we believe, and I should think is how most people with religious belief believe, right? That's the reason most people have for believing in God. It's what they learned. Right? And that is by default rational. Again, unless you have some sort of a defeater for it, or unless there is some reason, some substantial reasons for disbelieving it. So we can keep this idea of properly basic belief, but with some edits, we can add the intellectual tradition. So note, not everyone's religious beliefs are properly basic. If you're watching this video, whether you're in one of my classes or if you're just finding my YouTube channel and looking at various things to do with philosophy and philosophy of religion, chances are you've considered these arguments. You've thought about possible objections to religious belief. You've thought about possible reasons for religious belief. And given that you have these reasons, your belief is no longer non-inferential, right? It's inferred from other beliefs that you have, even if that's as simple as there are no defeaters, right? If you've thought of potential defeaters and ruled them out, your belief in religion is no longer properly basic. It's based on argument. It's based on other beliefs. It's based on arguments, evidence, etc. Right? So for you, and for me, this might not matter so much, but for most people, the fact that religious beliefs can qualify as properly basic or can qualify as part of, or that maybe I should say, that they can qualify as part of a community of belief, if we're going to use Zagzebski's terminology, that makes their religious beliefs rational, even if they don't have well-developed arguments or substantial evidence. All right. That, I think, sums up the idea and some of the objections to and some of the edits to Reformed epistemology that have been proposed. Like I said, I'm going to put below some links to relevant source material, some of the more cursory stuff. And of course, if you do have any questions about this isn't my primary area of expertise. I'm not an epistemologist primarily. But I have, to do with this, I have done pretty substantial research, and I do highly recommend some of the books I've mentioned, especially Rational Faith, edited by Linda Zagzebski, as well as Plantinga's Reasonable Faith, an anthology to do with just this topic. I highly recommend it as well. But if you do have any questions that I may be able to answer, feel free to comment below. I'd be happy to interact with you on here, on YouTube. If you're in one of my classes, of course, feel free to bring up any of the material that I've discussed here, either in class or again, feel free to comment below. And I will get to it if at all possible. I would be happy to either answer questions or to at least direct you to resources that might have answers to the questions that you've got. So for today, I think that's about all. So I hope this was informative. I hope this was helpful for you. And then I hope you also continue to explore these topics. So with that, I'll see you next time. Bye.